Hi, I'm Paul Battaglia, and this is section 2.1, Quadratic Functions and Models. Today we're going to talk about some teaching strategies that you can use in your classroom to help students get a little bit better with quadratic functions. And I have with me today Gabe and Brittany. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good.
Doing well.
Good, thank you. So before we do that, let me just tell you a little bit about how I might start this section. And I might give my students somewhat of an informal poll. I know that they've seen quadratic functions in Algebra maybe 2, most likely Algebra 1 and 2. And then I'll ask them some things like, tell me what you already know about a quadratic function. And if I want to make this even more interactive, I might actually use an online poll service where they could use maybe a tablet or a phone, something of that nature. Now, once we've done that and I've assessed where they are, then we get into the meat of the lesson, right? So let's talk, Gabe, a little bit about the importance of the vertex and what we want students to know.
Well, the vertex tells you a lot about the quadratic. In particular, it tells you a lot about the graph of the quadratic, the parabola.
Right.
So if you're thinking about the vertex, well, if your leading coefficient's positive, it'll tell you where the minimum value of your quadratic function is. If your leading coefficient's negative, it'll tell you where the maximum value of your quadratic occurs. And the x value from your vertex actually gives you x equals that value, gives you the axis of symmetry. So that's something that's great for students to know. And that sort of ties back into the ideas of symmetry that we talked about earlier.
Right.
But parabolas aren't necessarily symmetric about the x-axis,
Right, that's what students are thinking, right?
Or the origin. But it's symmetric about this line, the axis of symmetry, which comes up throughout this section.
Right, right. And then, Brittany, you and I had talked a little bit about an error that students make when they identify the axis of symmetry, right?
Yes, and instead of saying x equals 2, knowing that the axis of symmetry is a line, they'll just say it's number 2.
Right. Yeah, and you know, it's interesting too, because then when you go to find the actual vertex, that even, I think, leads them to believe that the vertex itself is a number instead of a point, you know, and I think that's something that we always have to watch out for as teachers, right? So the other thing we need them to do is be able to take a form such as ax squared plus bx plus c and not be, kind of married to that, for lack of a better term, right? We need them to be able to be fluent in getting to that standard form. So one of the things that we may have to review with them, Gabe, you and I were talking about, is a certain process, right?
Yeah. So in order to go from that ax squared plus bx plus c form to standard form, students should know how to complete the square.
Right.
So that's something that you may want to review earlier in this lesson about quadratics, because that's something that's going to come up over and over again throughout the course and maybe even into calculus. Part 2, I know it comes up quite a bit in integration.
And don't think there aren't any errors there too, because when you're reviewing that completing the square process, you have a situation where students will probably be very comfortable with the process when a is 1. But as soon as a is not 1, all of a sudden that kind of throws a wrench into the whole plan, right? So yeah, definitely something I think you'd want to review with your students first before you get into some of those other forms. And so, Brittany, tie it back for the teachers. Tell them a little bit about why the standard form becomes so important to things that they talked about in chapter 1 in terms of moving the graph and stuff like that.
Well, once you have your vertex, students will realize the vertex will be shifted. It most likely won't be at the origin.
Correct.
Which is what Gabe was saying, even with the axis of symmetry, we're going to have it over farther.
Right.
And so we'll be doing translations again from chapter 1.
Right. There's that idea, of trying to get the students to understand that just because we're talking today about quadratic functions and maybe we talk about completing the square doesn't mean that we won't be talking about things that came up, a couple weeks ago or days ago, whatever it might be. So I hope these tips have been helpful for you. I'm sure you'll find much success in section 2.1.